Hello, Senator Tarr. It's been such a long time since I've spoken to you.
It's great to see you, Heather, and great to see that wonderful Lanesville sunshine streaming through those windows, but it does seem like it's been a very long time.
Yeah, when we were speaking off camera, I had to say Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year, Happy President's Day, all those things. So let's start with you being sworn in on the first Wednesday in January of 2023. What's happened since then?
So there are a lot of things that need to be done infrastructurally to get the legislature organized. And the very first thing is what you mentioned, where we get sworn in. I was also reelected by my Republican colleagues as the minority leader of the Senate once again. As part of that ritual, I also run for Senate president, but that is a party line vote. And so unfortunately, I came in number 2. But But once the legislature is organized in that sense, and we've elected our leadership, then the next step is to begin filing bills. And so bills were due to be filed in January, and the filing deadline was met with the filing of over 6,000 bills.
Now, is that normal or is that typical?
That is fairly normal these days. It's actually down for what it would have been years ago, but for the last several years, that's been right in the ballpark of the number of bills that we would expect. Mm-hmm. Those bills have to go to committees. So then we have to adopt rules to create those committees. And there are 2 sets of rules that get adopted by the House and the Senate. One is a set of rules that applies only to the branch that is adopting them. So the House adopts a set of House rules, the Senate adopts a set of Senate rules, and then each branch has a proposal for the joint rules, which are the rules that govern our joint operations. And that's very significant since most of our committees are actually joint committees that consist of 11 members of the House and 6 members of the Senate. And so while the Senate has given final approval and we've adopted our rules and the House has adopted their rules, we have not yet agreed on the joint rules. And so a conference committee has been appointed, and that conference committee will be meeting. In the last session, there was never an agreement reached on the joint rules. And so we carried forward with the rules that had been in place in the prior session. I'm hoping that we're going to get an agreement this year because there's a lot at stake in terms of transparency and accessibility to the public for information and other kinds of things that we've been working on very hard, particularly in the Senate, over the last several years. So I'm hoping we're going to be able to reach an agreement on that. But that being said, the conference committee did report out in part one item, and that is the committees themselves. So the committees are established, the clerks are referring those bills to their committees, and we are now in the process of considering co-sponsorships. So we get requests from constituents, other legislators, organizations, to co-sponsor particular bills. And right now I have a stack, Heather, that's, and this is no exaggeration, it's at least that thick, of trying to determine what should be co-sponsored and what not, and what needs more of a committee process before I can make a decision like that. So there's a lot going on in that respect.
So why does something need to be co-sponsored?
Well, it's a way to show early support for a particular bill or a particular issue. And the bills need to be submitted by at least one legislator in either the House or the Senate. Something that sometimes folks don't grasp at first is that members of the House and Senate can co-sponsor each other's bills. So a bill that's filed in the Senate can be co-sponsored by a House member, and a bill filed in the House can be co-sponsored by a Senate member. But once you get past the first sponsor, the co-sponsors lend their support. They are essentially signaling to their colleagues that this is an issue that we're interested in and we'd like this to move through the legislative process. The challenge to that is sometimes when a bill is initially filed, all of its nuances and all of its details aren't completely understood. And so while there might be a temptation to co-sponsor it because you like an idea, sometimes it's important to read through the text of the bill and fully understand it. And unfortunately, there's limited time to be able to do all that given the volume of co-sponsorship requests that we receive.
Well, so at this point, the governor has submitted her first budget to the legislature for your debate and ultimate approval. So tell us what that process is like.
So the governor, in many ways, initiates the budget process by filing her proposal. She goes first, and her budget proposal is known as House One, being the first document. And that budget proposal is given a little bit extra time for a new governor. So she had some additional weeks to be able to put together her budget and to file it. And when she did, and I'm sure that we can talk about this much more as the process unfolds because there's a lot of detail here. But just a couple of highlights. Number one, my recollection is the budget's about $55 billion. And that's reflective of the fact that we continue to collect tax revenue at a very, very strong pace. For January, which is the last month that I have good numbers for, we were about $1 billion over our benchmark. Now that benchmark is going to be adjusted for March. So it's probably that surplus is not going to be as large, but the order of magnitude is the same. So we are on track to have a very significant budget surplus. That being said, the governor does in her budget proposal increase the amount of Chapter 70 money for our local schools by over $630 million in line with the Student Opportunity Act. And she also increased what we generally call local aid, but which is technically called unrestricted general government aid, or UGA. And she increased UGA by over $24 million. So something that folks are always concerned about is the money that we're sending to the cities and towns to help them perform some of the most basic functions that government touches in anyone's lives. But along with that, the governor also filed a very robust tax relief plan. And that is significant because, as you recall, in the waning days of the last legislative session, the formal session, the House and Senate had agreed to a package of tax cuts. They weren't exactly the same, but they were conceptually the same. And we did not get that to the governor's desk in the last legislative session. Governor Healy has signaled that she wants to continue that effort, and she filed a tax relief package that is very significant. It is over $800 million, and it includes many of the same components that we had been working for in the legislature. My caucus actually had written to her as she was putting together her budget, asking for her to include some of those things because there was agreement on them, and we wanted to pick up the momentum that we had. And she was creative with some of the other items. So the budget is significant because it makes investments in schools, in local aid, but also contains a place for the taxpayer as well. And again, we'll have a lot more to talk about because as we go forward, the House and Senate Ways and Means Committees will be dealing with that budget proposal. As you recall, the House will put forward a proposal in late March or early April, and they'll debate that version of the budget in April, and we will follow suit in May. But right now, the House and Senate Ways and Means Committees are meeting jointly and holding hearings all across the state, one of which is going to be on Cape Ann in Gloucester, courtesy of the vice chair of the committee, who is our state representative, Ann Margaret Ferranti. So people will get a chance, if they choose to see this really up close and participate in that hearing, either by offering testimony or at least coming to watch as the committee does its work.
Yeah, I think that's so much fun. So do we know where that meeting will be? It's March 31st. And what's the focus of the meeting? It's the budget. It's a 2024 budget, but there is a particular focus, right?
I don't have those details right now, but it definitely be on March 31st. And the committees break up the budget by subject matter. So it will be on one set of issues that are involved in the state budget. And I actually sit on the Senate Ways and Means Committee. And so we'll be getting a lot of that information, and we can pass it on to you soon. Because we'd love to encourage people to come and witness firsthand how the budget is put together.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting way to participate. So you have another budget that you're working on. Speaking of budgets, so their budgets are everywhere. Tell us what's going on with the supplemental budget for one of the many for 2023.
So one of the things that happens, Heather, is that you can't predict everything perfectly. And so situations arise during a fiscal year where you might have a shortfall in one account. You may have a surplus in another account. There may be contingencies that arise that need to be addressed in terms of policy. And so supplemental budgets are used to course correct while you're in the middle of a fiscal year. And the governor has just filed her first, which the House approved last week. and which the Senate is going to be taking up on Thursday with amendments due by tomorrow. We're talking on Monday. Tomorrow is Tuesday, and so amendments will be due by Tuesday at 5 o'clock. And it includes a number of things, and I don't think that it would be productive to go into detail on every item, but a couple of things that are worthy of note. Number one is the issue of SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Program that is largely funded by the federal government. And when the Congress declared that the pandemic emergency was going to come to an end, that meant that the additional SNAP benefits that people were getting as a result of that emergency were going to be discontinued. Mm-hmm. And so this represents a situation that I predict we're going to have to think about a lot over the next several months when the federal government backs away from one of these emergency provisions. The question is, what is the state going to do, if anything, to be able to backfill that program? And in this case, in this supplemental budget, there are dollars to step down the SNAP benefit, but to still add to it. So it's not going to be what it was prior to the pandemic emergency. It's going to be somewhere in between, and that will get us roughly through the end of the fiscal year, and then there'll be decisions that have to be made. But again, that represents a contingency that we couldn't necessarily have predicted, but that we do need to address. And there are other kinds of items of that kind of spending, but there are also some very important policy elements to this supplemental budget. And they contain things that we did as state government to help folks deal with the pandemic. One of the ones that we hear the most about is outdoor dining, to allow communities to allow outdoor dining by our restaurants. And as you know, that was authorization was about to expire. I have offered several amendments and bills to make it permanent. But right now, where I suspect that we'll land is just to extend it. And I'm just looking to see what the date that we were discussing was. And it is going to be until April 1st of 2024. And that's the most likely result. In addition to that, Heather, we've had a lot of calls about local meetings because the authorization is going to expire for select board meetings, planning board meetings, health board meetings. And this supplemental budget contains an authorization to allow the remote conducting of those meetings until March 31st of 2025. Mm-hmm. So again, pushing things out a little bit. I don't think this is the last time that we will look at this. And my suspicion is that we will probably extend these further or we will make them permanent. But there are a lot of nuances to this and a lot of details. We want to protect access, we want to make sure everyone can contribute, and we need to think about the format of these. But for right now, we're going to extend them. One last thing that I would mention is remote notarization of documents, which became very important during the darkest days of the pandemic, and those would be extended indefinitely in this supplemental budget.
Mm. And there also, there's something like $814 million in bond obligations. Do you want to, within the Senate version of the supplemental budget, do you want to talk about any of that? Is any of that?
Yeah, I will speak to it, and I actually just brought the list up of what those additional authorizations are. But I think first it's important to understand that when we authorize these amounts, they are not appropriated. What we are doing is allowing the administration to spend up to these amounts. Mm-hmm. And so one of them that's very interesting to me is the amount for the federal program for computer chips and processing chips.
What I was going to ask you about. That was the one that interested me. Yeah, tell us.
So we are very interested in redomesticating the production of these chips. And of course, that has a direct bearing for us on Cape Ann because of Applied Materials. And so we want to be able to have more of that kind of manufacturing in Massachusetts. And there is a federal program to do exactly that, to redomesticate the manufacturing of these chips. But the governor alerted us a couple of weeks ago that it is likely that Massachusetts will need to provide a match for some of those federal funds. So what she has asked for, and I think there'll be universal support for, is a bond authorization so that she can spend money, the proceeds of a borrowing by issuing a bond, to be able to do that. And the reason that we can do that with a bond authorization is that the benefits of it are likely to last for greater than 5 years. If we redomesticate this industry, we're going to build infrastructure, and those things are not necessarily the subject of 1 year's worth of spending, which is why it's not going in the operating budget. It's going in as a bond authorization. And she will be allowed to spend up to that amount, but there's no requirement that she spend any of it. So it's there if in the negotiating process and as the federal program plays out, we determine that we need funding, she'll have it available to spend.
Wow, so much is happening. That's so interesting. So the supplemental budget goes to, so what happens to it this week? We're talking about
amendments are due by tomorrow at 5 p.m. for us. We will debate the bill on Thursday. I suspect that it won't be a very long debate because this is a fairly minimal supplemental budget as things go. So I don't think there'll be too many items of controversy or disagreement. When it gets approved, then the next question is, how does it get reconciled with the budget that the House did, the supplemental budget? And so that can go one of two ways. There can be some brief negotiations and then one branch accedes to the other. Or the more likely path for this one is it goes to a conference committee of 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate who will get together and work out the details and get something to the governor's desk. The issue there is timing. A lot of these accounts are running short. And so they need to have the money before that spending stream is interrupted. So I have a fair degree of confidence that we will get this done in a timely way, but there's more process to go for sure.
All right. Well, anything you want to add to this particular interview when we haven't seen you for such a long time? We hope to see you again soon, and you're busy and to contribute from your busy agenda there.
So the one thing I would mention that is a bit of good news is that this supplemental budget does not need to include any additional funding for the home heating assistance program. We've been in touch with Elliot Jacobson at Action, who is one of the well-recognized state experts on that program. And he indicates that they're going to have enough funding in those accounts to get through this heating season. But we're thinking about what we might need to do for the future. So I know folks have been concerned about that. Obviously, the cost of home heating is very expensive. Fortunately, we've had a relatively mild winter, so it hasn't been as bad as it could be. So that's something that we don't have to address right now, but we're certainly looking to the future to make sure the program is stable.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all of this. And we haven't also mentioned the fact that this is Gloucester's 400th celebration of European settlers being here for 400 years. And do you have anything on your calendar in the near future for that?
Well, I would say we're off to a great start. The committee has done some incredible events. I have participated in 2 of them. In one of them, I narrated one of the segments of history of our city. And the second one was at the very beginning of the year. It was an event called The Overture, where we talked about broad themes and had several speakers and poets and musicians. And that was just a wonderful, wonderful experience to be part of. And I got to be the master of ceremonies. So there's a lot more coming, and I'm getting email updates constantly from the committee and its partners. And we'll have more to talk about that in the future, but a lot to come. All
right. Well, don't be a stranger. As I said, we hope to see you again soon.
Hope to see you again very soon. And again, always appreciate the opportunity to come and join with you on 1623 to be able to talk about things that are happening at the State House.
It's great. It's great to have you here. So we will see you actually in a couple of weeks, I think. All right.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather.